Hi, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. I hope you're all looking forward to what we're about to do. So this is a webinar from AgRewild and friends, and it is Rewilding Land, Sea and People. I'll just start. My name's Sean McCormack. I'm one of the co-founders of AgRewild. Just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. There's still some people joining along the way and probably will for the next few minutes. So welcome to all the new joiners. It's great to see so many people here, actually. There's 44, 45 people so far. So just in terms of housekeeping, the speaker is going to be, we have a few speakers today, and speaker is going to be unmuted, but I'd appreciate if everyone else could just keep their microphone on mute, if that's possible. And then I'll hand over to my colleagues, Felix and Cal, and they will unmute when they're talking about their presentation. At the very end, we're going to open the floor to discussion, to questions, and we've already got a few pre-submitted questions as well. But what we'd like to do is, if you have any questions or comments as we go through the presentation, then do feel free to use the chat box. We have Zoom meetings, we don't have Zoom webinars, so we don't have a Q&A box, but there is a chat box, and my colleague Heidi is going to be watching all of the chat and taking down any of your questions to put to us after. And if there's something specific that you would like to kind of chat about or anything at the end, if we have time, do feel free to kind of raise your hand and unmute, and we can have a discussion as well, but preferably using the chat box first would be great. It's quite useful for you as a viewer if you just hover over, go to the top right corner and click on view. You can choose speaker view or gallery view. It's definitely best for you if you choose speaker view, because that way you'll see more of the presentation and just who's speaking at the time, rather than seeing the massive grid of all attendees. So go to view, top right corner of the screen, and press speaker view rather than gallery view. And don't be afraid to use the chat function throughout. So I'll get started. I think we've got most people here now. There doesn't seem to be too many requesting to join. What we're going to do tonight is we have three speakers. I'm very happy to have these speakers joining us on our first AgRewild webinar. It's really great to have them on board. Who are we? What are we all about? I think the common thread, and we've been talking about doing this for months now and having great chats. The common thread, I think, that links us all is we're all conservationists and environmentalists at heart. And myself, I am a lifelong kind of nature fanatic and have been involved in conservation in various ways. By profession, I'm a vet, and I still work in veterinary medicine, but I do a lot on the side with a local wildlife group called Ealing Wildlife Group. Host a wildlife podcast, and potentially a couple of more media and TV things in the pipeline. Watch this space. We've also got Felix Appelbe, who is a solicitor and a farmer and a lifelong conservationist as well. And Felix has a very impressive CV. He's also the founder of a couple of charities, one being Ocean Ambassadors and another one, Save the Elephant. So Felix has a great history in conservation, and we're going to hear from Felix about his farm and how that's changed over the years in terms of his kind of outlook on it and what it means to him. And then last but by no means least, we have Cal Major, a good friend of mine, who is a fellow vet, but a serious ocean advocate and environmentalist, and also an award-winning and world record-holding adventurer. So Cal's going to talk to us about her kind of activism and environmentalism as well. So that's the speaker lineup for this evening. Here is what we're going to cover. So we've got a fairly packed agenda, I suppose. We're going to talk about just a quick intro about who is AgRewild, where have we come from, what do we stand for, what are we going to do, and then I'll get started by talking about practically what is rewilding. Apologies for anyone in the audience who's a true, rewilding fan or convert or expert. Some of it may be quite basic, but what I'd like to do is get everyone kind of up to speed on the general principles of rewilding, the rewilding movement. What does it mean? what might it mean for different stakeholders like large-scale landowners versus people that don't own land? How can people be involved in rewilding? And why is it important really for the climate change and the biodiversity loss crisis that we are facing at the moment? Then I'm going to hand over to Felix to talk a little bit about why rewilding has kind of captured his imagination and how he's seeing the return of nature to his farm, and the conservation work that he's been involved with all his life as well, before we show a very beautiful short film shot by Cal and her partner, telling the story of Felix and kind of the rewilding of his farm, Woodcock Farm. I think you'll agree it's beautifully shot and it tells the story quite well. And then Cal is going to talk to us about, that's all about kind of rewilding land and rewilding farmland in particular. But Cal is going to really focus on what's the importance of the oceans in rewilding and in climate change and biodiversity loss, and how rewilding ourselves, rewilding people, can really benefit us as well. So that's the kind of running order of what we're going to cover. And then obviously at the end, we will have time for questions and discussion. So looking forward to that. So before we get into it, who is AgRewild? AgRewild are a fairly new entity. Myself and my colleague Heidi Cullip have founded AgRewild, and we're in the very early stages, but effectively what we're trying to do is we are trying to buy land and create a space for people to discover a reconnection with nature, discover what rewilding means, discover kind of how agriculture and food production can work in harmony with nature as well. So it will be a physical space, but it will also be a kind of a learning hub and kind of raising awareness and raising kind of people's knowledge on how nature and food production can go hand in hand in harmony. I have a background, obviously, as a lifelong conservationist and a vet. Heidi has a very impressive background in marketing, mainly with several large kind of blue chip companies and things. And we're working together in the early stages now of kind of setting ourselves up as a not-for-profit social enterprise. And there's a lot of announcements coming soon and exciting news coming soon. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to visit our website. It's agrewilding.co.uk. and sign up to our newsletter, and that way you can stay in touch with everything that's to come. There's some very exciting stuff coming up. So I'm going to get started by asking the question, what is rewilding? And again, apologies if you're an expert in this, but a lot of people are kind of a bit confused. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment. A lot of people are using it in various ways, and a lot of people involved in rewilding are kind of arguing the definition. The fact is there is no true definition. There's no agreed definition to what rewilding is. So it can mean different things to different people. And I guess the fundamental kind of aspects of rewilding are that it's allowing space for nature. It's allowing nature to recover on its own terms. It's kind of stepping back away from this traditional tendency we've had to want to manage and tame the landscape and to kind of bend it to our will for specific objectives. So it can be a very passive process. It can be just about literally stepping back from nature or from an area of land, various scales and sizes. Some people will argue it's only true rewilding if it's over, 500 acres or 1,000 acres or whatever. But that's about the kind of processes that can happen at a large scale when you do step back and stop managing the landscape and allow nature to do its own thing. So that's the kind of fundamental principle of what rewilding is. Some would go further and say that it's about reintroducing lost species. Some would say that it's about restoring very, very kind of old ecosystems from the past, pre-ice age and de-extinction, bringing back extinct animals and things like that. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, we're not going to get into all of the amazing diversity of what rewilding means. We're going to talk about practically in a UK landscape and specifically around kind of farming, and Cal is going to cover the kind of ocean side as well. What does rewilding mean and where do people fit into that, I'd say would be the thing we're going to explore. And to start with, I think this little animal, if anyone recognizes it, kind of exemplifies for me the situation we've got into with nature in the UK at the moment. It's the water vole. It's the ratty of Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willow's tale. Not actually a rat, but a vole. And it's kind of a good symbol of the state of nature in the UK, because it's Britain's fastest declining mammal. It's undergone an extremely fast and severe decline, and kind of its distribution has kind of contracted as well. And we are in a sticky position. You know, we're in a sticky position with climate change. We're in a sticky position with pollution and the environment, but also with biodiversity loss. And the water vole is a good kind of example, because there's multiple reasons why their populations crashed in the UK. One is, you know, the agricultural revolution in the 40s and 50s, when we started to become more intensive in our management of the land for food production. We drained a lot of wetlands to bring more land into production. We also kind of damaged waterways. We tidied up and kind of sterilized canal systems and ditches, and we filled in ponds, and we lost a lot of the wetland habitat that water voles relied on. We also, because of the Industrial Revolution, spilled a lot of pollution into our waterways, which affected every layer of the food chain, and water voles were no exception to that when habitat degradation occurred. So the main insult, the main kind of first blow to the water vole's demise was habitat destruction, loss, and damage by pollution. And then something else happened, which was very much a man-made problem, which was in the late 80s and early 90s, we introduced accidentally through escape and deliberately through releases by animal rights activists, and the non-native North American mink, which was on fur farms. And the mink got into our ecosystems and absolutely devastated water vole populations. And the water vole was not evolved to cope with an aquatic predator like a mink. In North America, it feeds on a very similar rodent called a muskrat. So when it got here, it thought, you know, I have a steady supply here of water voles, and they can rapidly decimate a population in a matter of weeks. Water voles are not very mobile, so actually recolonizing some of their former ranges is very difficult unless you have habitat connectivity. And this is another problem, and it's something that the kind of rewilding movement and rewilding advocates talk about a lot, is not just about kind of restoring small little pockets of land here and there and allowing nature to recover. It's about connectivity. So you'll hear rewilders talking about bigger, better, more joined up landscapes where nature is healing. And that connectivity allows populations to recover and to move around the landscape better. So the water vole, I think, is just a very kind of poignant example of how we have really impacted some of our species. And in terms of biodiversity overall in the UK, the State of Nature report, the most recent one, said that most of our wild species are in decline and have been in decline since the 1970s. About 15% of the species, plant and animal, that they covered in this report are now at risk of extinction. The water vole very much being one of those. So it went on after the mink, it went under a 90% decline in the space of the 90s, in that decade. So catastrophic decline. It is something that we can bring back, but that's kind of part of the rewilding talk. And I'll talk about a very clever way we might be able to bring water voles back towards the end of my slides. Some of you who are familiar with the rewilding movement as well may recognize this before and after picture. So there's lots and lots of rewilding projects all over the UK, but when we're specifically talking about rewilding farmland, I think the highest profile example or project is the Knepp rewilding project in West Sussex. And Knepp is a 3,500 acre estate that was formerly cereals and arable land and beef production, and the owners were finding it very difficult about kind of 18-20 years ago to turn a profit on the heavy clay soils in West Sussex. And they decided through a series of events and conversations to try something very radical at the time and get permission from Natural England to do it as a sort of experiment, to turn over the landscape, to give up farming and turn over the landscape to nature to see what would happen. And they got backing from Natural England, but they were told that some of their ambitious plans to restore lost species and things would have to be reined in a little bit. And what you see here is, you know, what we traditionally describe on the left as our green and pleasant land. That's very familiar, kind of picturesque rolling countryside to a lot of people in the UK. But actually what it represents is a landscape that has been quite dominated by people, has been tidied and neatened, and has been where nature has been really pushed to the very edges of kind of hedgerows, woods, waterways and things. And the rest of the land has really been sort of obliterated in some ways to produce food at maximum efficiency possible. And unfortunately, that's a big part of why we've had such a decline in kind of wildlife species. What happened when NEP kind of changed their management and said, you know what, we're going to stop farming, we're going to see what happens, we're going to allow nature to recover, is that very rapidly a process called succession started to occur. And succession is basically where the landscape started to change from very managed mown grassland and crops in the fields to trees and shrubs and plants self-seeding and starting to develop a much more complex ecosystem. And a few years after they allowed this succession and this pulse of new vegetation to occur, they started to reintroduce some herbivores, either natural herbivores like red deer and things, and roe deer that were already there, but they also started to introduce domestic animals as agents of change within that landscape. So they introduced things like Exmoor ponies, they introduced longhorn cattle, they introduced Tamworth pigs, and all of those are what we call proxies of animals that we would have had in our landscape many thousands of years ago. So the Exmoor pony mimics the tarpan, the wild horse. The aurochs, or the wild bovine animal, the cattle that used to roam around Europe, were mimicked by the English longhorn cattle. And Natural England said no to wild boar, so NEP introduced some Tamworth pigs as a proxy for wild boar. And what they found is really interesting changes in the biodiversity and the dynamics of the landscape and what species were favouring it once those natural or long lost herbivores were managing this environment, which started to kind of be reclaimed by nature. And starting very small, what were the benefits? What were the outcomes of rewilding this space? Well, starting really small in the soil with fungi and bacteria and things like that are kind of the very base of soil health and the whole food system or food chain and ecosystem above it. They saw a richness return to the soil life, the kind of microbiome in the soil itself. And then a layer up on top of the soil, when they looked at their herbivores' fecal material, they noticed an abundance of insects coming back and invertebrates coming back. And they have a long list of dung beetles that were once extinct in Sussex now showing up in their on their cowpats, for example. And things like these dung flies, you know, there's just abundance of insects popping up. Why was that? Because they stopped using a lot of veterinary medicines. They went organic and extensive, and they stopped using things like wormers and parasitic medications and things in their cattle and their horses and their pigs, and therefore the dung didn't have any chemical residues in it, and they saw an absolute explosion in the insect diversity feeding on the dung. They saw an absolute explosion in insect biodiversity everywhere as nature started to recover. They saw more species that feed on these insects absolutely bloom, like bats. They have 13 of our 17 breeding species of bat on the estate now. So as they started to see these tiny little changes at the ground level, they started to see more and more biodiversity return. And they're now in a position where they have the densest population of nightingales, a very threatened bird or kind of declining bird in the UK. They have had an explosion of a very rare butterfly called the purple emperor, which they never would have thought of before. And they have one of the healthiest populations of turtle doves as well, another what we call traditional farmland bird. but actually, you know, is not a farmland bird at all, because farming is something that's very recent in kind of evolutionary terms. And what the animals at NEP are doing as kind of, again, proxies for what the landscape once looked like, is they're restoring these kind of dynamic processes to the landscape, where pigs, for example, are turning over and rootling for food in the grass turf, and they're allowing tiny little seeds in the seed bank from native wildflowers to flourish again and to pop up, and increasing the biodiversity. And some of these seeds are the very seeds that turtle doves rely on throughout the breeding season to kind of feed on and feed their chicks on. Another aspect of rewilding, which you will hear about, and this is where it can sometimes be a little bit controversial, is reintroduction of lost species. So the beaver, we've all probably seen, you know, a lot of media attention for the beaver in recent kind of couple of years. There's some high-profile trials of beaver reintroductions. Beavers who have been on the River Otter in Devon have been granted permission to stay. There was an accidental or deliberate illegal release of beavers about 25 years ago, and they're thriving down there in harmony with people, in close proximity to people. But what beavers are, why beavers are so popular and a kind of an icon of the rewilding movement, is that they're what we call a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that exists as a keystone in a wall exists, and it kind of holds up a load of other habitats and species and biodiversity, because it creates new life, it creates new habitat by damming water systems. It has benefits for flood alleviation downstream, because it's holding water on the land and not allowing it to rush through our kind of straightened, canalized rivers and water systems that we thought were a good idea, and actually have led to a lot of flooding problems. That's getting more and more prevalent with climate change, but beavers are seen as a bit of a solution to that. And when beavers start to dam waterways and create new canals between wetlands and ponds, and fell trees and allow light in to the bankside vegetation, you see a boom in biodiversity, both plant and animal life, from at every level of the food chain again, because they're creating really, really rich and dynamic ecosystems. And there's where water voles, you know, may come back, because the very kind of habitats that beavers are restoring are the ones that we've eliminated and put such pressure on water voles. So you can see here kind of all of the other species that kind of benefit from a beaver landscape. It's not just wild species that we, you know, are being put back or being reintroduced. We can also use domestic species, like NEP have, for example, with Exmoor ponies or cattle, or rootling pigs like the Tamworths. And all of those things graze and utilize the landscape in different ways and create lots of mosaic micro habitats in terms of how they graze plants, how they create new kind of edge habitats, and how they even stir up the ground, cattle stirring up the ground and things, having a benefit on species that like bare earth. So really, really kind of complex learnings from what's going on with those kind of experimental landscapes. The other thing which we're going to talk about, because it's all well and good to talk about rewilding is the solution to all our problems, but we don't have space perhaps for rewilding all of our countryside and producing food. We still need to produce food. So it's one of the criticisms of rewilding a lot, is, you know, how do people do rewilding alongside producing food and farming? And I think NEP have a very good model of combining ecotourism, getting kind of grant payments and things for natural capital and nature recovery, and also producing kind of a higher end, higher price point, extensive, high welfare meat products from their animals. This is a group of us from Ealing Wildlife Group that went down. We're looking at a turtle dove in that dead tree on the horizon, cooing away. So they've really built a model of kind of safaris and ecotourism, which is bringing in a lot of revenue. And just to finish up before I hand over to Felix to talk about, you know, the practicalities of where does rewilding fit in with owning a farm and making it a profitable enterprise, I think we're seeing a shift in farming and agriculture to how can we as food producers change over to producing food in a way that is in harmony with nature, works with nature rather than against it. And we're seeing a great movement in regenerative agriculture. If you haven't heard of it, would kind of say it's a huge topic to delve into, but it's about really restoring the soil and allowing nature to recover and not being so aggressive in our ways of managing the land. And that has massive benefits in terms of kind of carbon sequestration and not being so destructive to the environment as well. So I'm going to hand over to Felix. He's going to talk a little bit about kind of his journey and his growing interest in rewilding, and then we'll see a short film called Rewilding Woodcock about Felix's farm. So Felix, over to you.
Sean, thank you very much indeed. That was amazing. I could talk for hours on this, but we have a limited time. And a lot of what I'm going to say is in my film that Cal Major made wonderfully for me. But I'm going to start with romance. To me, the whole thing is romantic. At age 3, before dawn, feeding the chickens, and that rough smell of the corn and the taste of it, and it's still etched in my memory. It may sound odd, but it's just important. So I felt, and I'd go out at dawn and dusk every day. I'd get up 5 in the morning or earlier and be out as a guest on this planet. It was a time for the birds and the animals. And if somebody came with me, we didn't talk, we just listened. And that led into my father, particularly, and my parents teaching me some poetry. Now, you know, there was an old tramp, I think he was, W.H. Davis, who said, "What is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare." And I then, about 5 years old, I remember sitting with my father in the dusk, and suddenly I realized, like an electric shock, what beauty was. It was a crow sitting in a monkey puzzle tree, believe it or not. I can still see that. But these images are important, I think, for all of us. And that electric shock, that beauty, meant there was no turning back. And ever since the age of 4, I've wanted to farm. And I've struggled away to get it, but I loved every minute, and I still do. I've been planting trees today. If I had one desire, that is to allow other children, particularly, to have those experiences and to be part of nature. And Sean has illustrated this very well. You've got to be in nature itself. You can learn so much from a computer, but not the real stuff. Be in nature. So listen, without further ado, have a look at this lovely film that my friend Cal has made. I'll leave you with it. Can't hear any sound.
Sean, we can't hear the video.
Felix, can you mute? Would you mind, please? Can you hear that now, Heidi?
It's quite quiet. Can you turn us up a bit? No, still no sound, Sean.
Hi all, sorry to intervene, Fionn here. Hi Felix. What might work, Sean, is if you stop sharing your screen and then go to start sharing it again, you can press a button that says add computer audio. Sarah's already mentioned it in the chat, but I think that might work.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That is Great tip. So start sharing again now, and yeah. Okay. Sorry about this, folks.
It's all good. Now navigating a crazy virtual world.
I know. So then if I play now, it didn't come up with share audio though. Let's just see. Can you hear that?
No. It's very, very quiet, very faint.
Fionn, could I get you to explain that again? Sorry.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So you should be able to press the share screen button, and what normally happens is when you press that, you come up with a variety of options on what to click, and you may almost automatically go to desktop straight away because that's what you'd normally use. But actually, if you want to share something that contains audio,
I see
do you see it?
Great. It says share sound in the bottom corner. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Hopefully, third time lucky, folks. this works. Okay, here we go. Let's see.
At a point, I realized how
perfect.
Nature.
Yeah, thank you.
We were the dominant people, the pioneers with everything, and yet how mistaken we were. How by dominating we might win for the short term, but not in the long term. My name's Felix Appelbe, and we're in Gloucestershire on my farm, and I came here in 1972, a really run-down place. As a child, I wanted to be a farmer when I was 4. Either be a farmer or a railway engine driver. Yes, Sonny, but what do you really want to do? I said, I want a farm. And this is where I discovered this farm. It grew out of my boots. I'd seen a few farms before, but this one grew through my boots. And I was just young and innocent, and I said, oh yes, I'll buy the farm. And it's been a great joy ever since. It's been absolutely wonderful. When I was 10 years old or so, I used to work on a farm down in Somerset. And I had a very interesting experience, many experiences. One was that I worked potato picking with prisoners who were allowed out for the day, and they came every year. And my great friend became Wilf, who was much older than I was. He's about 100, I think. And he used to sign his name with a cross. They were on the paper bags that he got paid for. Anyway, the point is that at the farm, my great hero in life was called Dr. William Plant. Dr. William Plant, a very appropriate name, I asked him, I said, tell me about the farm or what you're doing, because he was a plant pathologist. And he said, I'm at the Long Ashton Research Centre and I'm creating something called a selective herbicide. So I said, what does that mean? And he said, what it means is that we can spray a field of grass, but we're trying to get rid of the weed and not the grass. So I said, tell me more. He said, well, take a thistle, for example. We want to get rid of the thistle. I feed the thistle with something it loves. And it grows, and it drinks it all in, and it takes it down to its roots, and poof, it explodes. I thought this was fantastic. But those few remarks were one of the biggest revolutions in agriculture you can imagine. Because this was the beginning of the big spraying with the Roundup and the glyphosate and things like that. Anyway, I obviously went along with it. I was young and keen and I wanted to grow wheat. We had wall-to-wall wheat, and we sprayed everything, and my friends even brought an airplane in to spray everything. It was terribly exciting. Anyway, I began to feel more and more that the humus in the soil was waning. And I'd go and smell the soil, and I felt somewhere intuitively it wasn't quite right. Anyway, to cut a long story short, when eventually I brought the farm back to myself, like here, I thought we'll let it, I use the word rewild because it's fashionable these days, but I don't mean it quite as simple as that. I mean, let it do its own thing. I've seen this field in the 70s, deep mud, and somebody going over it with a sort of quad bike and a fertilizer spinner, struggling in the rain, because we were planting winter wheat, or we had planted winter wheat, and we were trying to feed it. And what is he doing? He's putting nitrogen on the plant to make it grow. That nitrogen, that nitram, is actually oil-based and has come from perhaps the North Sea, under the North Sea, or maybe the Arabian Desert. So man in his wisdom has gone over to the Arabian Desert, dug a big hole, got out some black liquid and made it into oil. And now we're pouring it onto the earth here, which once was under the sea as well. Anyway, when I took the farm back more into my own hands, nitrogen was getting very expensive. Oil prices were rocketing, and I felt there was a better alternative, and that was to plant red clover. And I talked to the Dutchy farm nearby, which is an organic farm, and they helped me put a grass lay down with a lot of red clover in it, because that's nitrogenous and has a leguminous a root that gives out nitrogen. And after 3 years of that, you could grow a crop of wheat without any fertilizer at all. So the local farmers thought, Felix, what are you up to this time? And I said, well, you watch this space because it might be cheaper for you to do the same. Anyway, I noticed a number of them adopting it now, which is rather heartening. This is interesting. This explains a few things. First of all, these fields, sometimes when we had the big wheat, wall-to-wall wheat, bigger machines didn't like hedges, and they tend to get ripped out a bit. And this field was 30 acres before, and I decided now, more recently, to plant new hedges and make smaller fields. So this is a new hedge about 8-9 years old. Nice wooden gates always. And there's another one over there, which is also, so we've got two or 3 acre paddocks. Not so good really for big machinery, but perfectly all right for sheep and for cutting as well. And this field here is interesting because this is slightly difficult soil. In a way, we've come off the brash, the Cotswold brash, and it hangs pretty heavy in here, this one field, and you get a different habitat. And we've planted here a sort of yellow clover that will again be a winter larder for small birds, and a couple of big patches of canary grass which I've saved, which will give a lot of winter cover in the cold winter months. There's something I just love about small fields. and also they act as corridors for wildlife to hide in and go from one area to another. I'd just like to show you this quickly because this is exactly a mixture. Here is a grass called canary grass that is long and stalky. We don't use it for anything except it's a wonderful winter shelter for, warm winter shelter for birds. And it's not just a monoculture, it's got a lot of weeds in it, you'll see, a lot of docks. And these dock seeds will be a feast for certain birds. And it's near the hedge so that birds can protect themselves from predators, and yet they can come out here and dry themselves off as well. And one of my great aims is to get them so that they naturalize these birds, and and I'm very keen to get grey partridges. I don't know why they're so elusive, but we've got the habitat now for them, and I just love to see them. And I would like to encourage them as much as I can. I'm trying very hard to find them. I also would like to say something that is a bit more personal, that it's not all plain sailing, all this, you know. You get disasters, and I'll show you this chair here, because my house burnt down, and I was ploughing a field and somebody rang and said, oh, there's a problem with your something around, and I didn't think anything of it and drove back and found that there's smoke pouring out of the roof, and it's something that doesn't happen to you until it does. Anyway, these are the old beams of the house, so I thought I'd make it into a seat where my old dog was buried, my old friend. He was a great pal. His name was Badger, and he and I went through a few traumas, and I learned a lot from him. He's a wise guy. I liked him. And here we've got these lovely marsh orchids, which are beginning to go over a bit, but you get these coming through, and there's a few more. Here's a beautiful purple one here, more vivid. Here. Isn't that beautiful? Underspoken beauty. And look, you can add a bit of colour with it. Look at that. Why go to the Tate Gallery? You've got it all here. Now, here's a stone wall. A few weeks ago, you wouldn't have seen this wall at all. It was covered in brambles, huge amount of brambles, and the wall was completely fallen down in the brambles. And I thought, oh, I'll get my friend the stone waller to do it. And then I thought, no, I'll do it. And that's what you do here, because it's fun. And you're daunted at first, you think, oh, I can't do that. And here you'll see a prime example of amateur stone walling This is called farmer stonewalling, and it's botched up a bit. I know that because I was always in a hurry, but it's all right. And you don't have to be an expert on things. Just do it. And an old boy, he never taught me, but I used to do a little bit with him, and he said the great trick is when you pick up a stone from the ground, put it in the wall, don't put it down again. And it makes you much faster, and also your eye gets accustomed to what's needed, and you just do it. So I'm proud of this wall in one respect, I did it, but not so proud because it isn't the best in the world. But it's still a stone wall, and it's part of its heritage. And it'll be a home in here for a weasel or maybe a grass snake or anything. There are lots of things will live in here. Quite nice, out of the wind. And so, yeah, just get on with it, that's what I say. And also have passion. And so you walk past it and you think, yeah, I did that. Yeah. So this is my favorite tree, one of my favorite trees I've known since childhood. It was this high when I found him in London, and I put him in a pot and I looked after him for a few years and into another pot, and then I brought him down here and I planted him, and he's grown, and I've known him all my life. It's a sycamore, and last week I took away the lower brows to reveal his beautiful trunk, and he said, oh, I'm so handsome, and he's a good friend. I like him, and it just shows you what you can do. I've sometimes been asked, why are you doing this? What's your end game? I haven't got an end game. If I had an end game, it's the journey. As Lawrence, what was his name? Louis Stevenson said, it's better to travel than to arrive. And this is a journey, it'll never end. In the Greeks say, pantareia, everything flows. Even things that you think are static, like this bit of stone, they're not. They're full of atoms. They're actually moving. Everything flows, and life flows. So this discussion in 100 years' time will be different than now. I hope it'll be wiser. I'm just a pilgrim on the journey.
Well, thanks for that. I hope you all enjoyed it. Amazing footage there, and amazing kind of connections that we see with nature. So I'm just going to come out of this and then stop, share my screen again. So next up, thank you for that, Felix. It's brilliant. We'll talk more about it at the end. But I want to introduce Cal next to kind of bring us away from the kind of land aspect of rewilding and talk about rewilding the sea and people. So over to you, Cal. I'll just share my, yeah, just bring it up now.
So first of all, I absolutely cannot take the credit for that film. That's my partner's filming and editing. I just stood around in the field and suggested what might be nice to film. So thanks to James for filming and editing that. So my name's Cal, and it's lovely to see so many people here tonight, and to hear from Sean and Felix, who are incredibly wise humans. And I can't claim myself to be an expert in rewilding. I can't claim to be an expert of ocean rewilding. I've spent a lot of time out at sea and around the sea, and met many, many people along the way. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk to you today is what I've learned through those journeys, what I've learned from the amazing, insightful people I've met around the ocean. Next slide, thanks. So the first question I have is, why is the ocean important? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to you? You know, you might be here because you're interested in rewilding the land, you're interested in a small scale or a large scale terrestrial rewilding project. Well, I'd like you to start by closing your eyes, and hopefully none of you fall asleep. I know it's nearly bedtime, but if you close your eyes, I'd like you to take a big deep breath with me. This might actually wake you up. Hopefully it keeps everybody awake. Now I want you to take another deep breath with me, and this time I want you to really fill your belly, fill your lungs, take the deepest breath you've taken all day. Ready? Go. Okay. Open your eyes now. You can look at that beautiful manta ray. So that second breath that you took there, the oxygen in that breath was produced in the ocean, produced in the ecosystems in the ocean. The rivers that run through our country, they all connect us to the sea. So wherever we are in the world, we are all connected to the ocean through the breath that we breathe. Geographically, the ocean connects us all globally. It's responsible for our clean water, food security to millions of people around the world. It's an incredibly important environment. And it's very threatened. It's threatened by a lot of different things at the moment. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, plastic pollution crisis. But it's also phenomenally important for all of those issues, for carbon sequestration, which we've heard a little bit about from Sean, for maintaining biodiversity, and also for the awe and wonder that it provides. If you've ever been to the ocean, I hope you felt that sense of awe and wonder. I hope you felt that boost to your mental health by being by the blue, which is so proven to be beneficial for our well-being. So we're taught a lot at the moment about the climate crisis and about the need to decarbonise and about how everything is in relation to our carbon output. But actually, biodiversity loss is a much more pressing threat. There was a report released a couple of years ago, the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the report that came out a couple of years ago, at the same time as Harry and Meghan had a baby, which is why maybe you might not have heard of it. But this report basically detailed that biodiversity loss was the biggest threat that humankind had ever faced. And biodiversity is the diversity within species and within an ecosystem. And that's what keeps us healthy. That's what keeps our seas clean. That's what keeps them being able to produce oxygen. That's what keeps us as humans healthy. We need a healthy animal population, a healthy planet to have healthy humans, and vice versa. We're all so interconnected, as I'm sure you're all aware. And this report basically detailed that the decline in biodiversity was at an unprecedented rate, and that 1 million species are at risk of becoming extinct. 33% of corals, marine corals and marine mammals are highly threatened. But it also reported that all is not lost. There is hope. We need to take action immediately, locally and globally. And if we do, then we can recover from this terrible state that the world is in. And I'm here to talk to you about the positive things that we can do here, and how we can reconnect, and what we need to be focusing on in terms of keeping that positivity alive. So next slide, please, Sean. So this is one example of how the ocean ecosystems can revive themselves. The ocean, in terms of the biodiversity loss in the ocean and a lot on land as well, it's due to land use change terrestrially, and also in the ocean as well. So we're looking at basically anthropogenic factors, so human-made factors which are destroying these environments. So we've got things here, like on the left, this is the ocean floor after it's been bottom trawled or dredged. You look at things like dams in rivers, which completely destroy the ecosystem, destroy the source to sea biodiversity and the way that the ecosystem behaves. But this image here, on the left, you've got the bottom trawled ocean floor. On the right is the same area after it's been given an opportunity to revitalise. Our ocean is phenomenally resistant. It just needs to be given the opportunity to become a biodiverse haven once more. And this is in Lamlash Bay off the Isle of Arran, Scotland's first no-take zone, where basically they've designated a small area of ocean where they've said, right, no destructive human practices whatsoever. You can't take anything from this environment. And within a matter of years, this ocean seafloor has regenerated to this degree where we're finding enormous biodiversity, corals, sponges, shellfish, fish, mammals. It's a haven for biodiversity. And I think sometimes, you know, we can look at rewilding, especially terrestrial rewilding, as this really complicated process where we have to look at reintroduction. And I appreciate that there is a lot of that involved, especially with areas where you are confining it to a certain area. But in the ocean, we just need to stop our destructive human practices as a starter for 10. So the next slide, please. So as I said before, I've basically a lot of my anecdotes and my stories come from a lot of time spent out at sea, exploring the ocean, adventuring in the ocean. And a couple of years ago, I stand-up paddleboarded from Land's End to John O'Groats, the whole length of the UK. And I was looking at plastic pollution, looking at the positive things we can do to alleviate plastic pollution, talking to communities and local people about what they were doing to help prevent it, trying to find inspiring stories that I could share with the country so that more people would be inspired to make change. And I found a lot of plastic. Next slide, please, Sean. So during my journey, it was about 1,000 miles long, about 800 miles were out at sea, but about 200 miles were inland. So I came up the rivers and canals in the middle of the country, in the middle of England. And this is on a canal one day in Wigan. So I'd been paddling for about a month at this point. And I came across a canal in Wigan where in one morning I picked up nearly 700 single-use plastic bottles that were floating at the surface of the canal. And canals and rivers, they connect us to the ocean. They connect us to this global ecosystem, which connects every single person around the world and which is so important for our health, our physical well-being, and literally sustaining our life and every animal's life on this planet. And yet there seemed to be this real disconnect between that fact and the actions of the individuals in Wigan. And this isn't to shame anybody that was living in Wigan. This is more demonstrative of our disconnect as human beings from our natural world. We've become completely disconnected. We're urbanized. We live in these concrete walls. We spend very little time in nature, and yet nature is where we've developed to be. And so is it any wonder that we're seeing scenes like this when we have such little connection to how our actions impact our natural world, and moreover, what that natural world means to us as individuals? Next slide, please, Sean. This contrasted very greatly to a community I met on the west coast of Scotland. I just spent the entire night paddling around one of the most challenging headlands in the entire United Kingdom. I was absolutely exhausted. I paddled through the night around this headland and rocked up at this little fishing village at about lunchtime, basically dumped my bags and board on the beach and crawled up to the nearest pub and fell asleep in the corner. And when I woke up, was met by this amazing group of people, and they were questioning what I was doing, like why was I there, what my mission was. And I started explaining about my desire to talk to people about plastic pollution and to help more people understand that they too could be the solution to it. And instantly their faces lit up, and they were so excited to tell me about all the things that they were doing in their community to protect their local beaches from plastic pollution. And this is us the next day on an impromptu beach clean that they organised for while I was there. And I got talking to these guys and started hearing their stories and hearing all the phenomenal things that they were doing to reduce plastic in their environment. And it all came down to the reason that they were doing this is because they absolutely loved they loved their beaches, and they were horrified to see plastic on their beaches every day. They were so connected to that environment. And it made me realise that I could speak to people about plastic pollution in our oceans till I was blue in the face, but unless they had their own personal connection to that place, they weren't necessarily going to understand why it's important or relevant to them. People will protect what they love, but they can only love what they know. They can only love what they have experience of. And this group of people in Port Patrick, in this little fishing village in Scotland, really, it was like a light bulb moment. It's like, okay, so this is what connection means. It means this real appreciation of what that place means to them, and that drive as a result to protect it. Next slide, please, Sean. A year or so later, I met this amazing bunch of young people. These are the Ullapool Sea Savers, and these guys are going one step further. So this is a group of kids who are completely connected to their environment in Ullapool, and I really wanted to show you a little film of them snorkeling in their kelp forests in their loch, but I figured you might be a bit filmed out by this point. But these guys, basically, the kelp in their loch was threatened by dredging, and they basically said, not on our watch. And they lobbied their local MSPs, they went to Parliament, and they galvanised their community into creating this voice of people that you could not ignore. You can't ignore these guys. They're so passionate and so dedicated to protecting their environment. And their message was that this is their playground, this is the place they love, they spend time there. And once you've spent time there, you can't help but fall in love with it. And when a place like that is threatened, again, you can't help but stand up and use your voice in as loud a capacity as you possibly can to fight for its protection. And this is one of the things that the IPBES report that I referenced earlier also demonstrated, was that local communities, and particularly Indigenous communities, are the best placed and the most successful at protecting local areas, whether that's terrestrial or marine. And by that I mean, yes, we are facing a global biodiversity crisis, we're facing a global climate crisis, but each of us has a local area that we can focus on improving, and that is so important. If we look at our country like a mosaic, if we look at it like lots of little patches that, yes, they need to be interconnected, and we need those wildlife corridors, but each of us has a role that we can play in our local community, then that is the most powerful way, I think, of affecting change. Next slide, please. And I think there's another really important factor that we need to take into consideration when we look at reconnecting to nature. So I love this quote from John Muir, which is that thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wildness is a necessity. And you could replace that word mountains with ocean or rivers or park down the road, whatever. Once you've found somewhere that you can really connect to, that is your wildness, and that is the necessity. And we are facing a mental health crisis in our country as well as an environmental crisis. And I think if we can just find that reconnection, that individual, personal, meaningful connection to our natural world, each and every one of us to a particular part of that natural world, then we're going to be much better placed to protect it. We can appreciate what it means to our well-being, to our mental health, then we're going to fall in love with it, and we're going to want to protect it. So next slide, please, Sean. So we need this paradigm shift. We need this enormous shift of consciousness and appreciation of nature, this reconnection to our natural world. And also to our communities, to our local communities, and understanding the strength that we have in connecting back to our local communities. And yes, we need to rewild the sea. We need to give the sea opportunity to regenerate. But I think first, before we can expect people want to do that, we need to rewild the people first. So that's it for me, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cal. That's brilliant. Heidi, I'm sure I've seen the chat box go off, so I'm sure we do have some questions from the audience, but I'd just start with one for Cal, if I can, which is, you know, how do we reconnect people to the sea? How do you rewild people?
Yeah, and it's going to be very individual for everyone, but you know, you can't tell people what to think. You can't say to somebody, hey, if you go to the ocean, you're going to feel amazing. They might absolutely hate it. You know, it's scientifically proven that being in blue spaces is beneficial for mental health. And I think that appreciation on an individual level of how it feels to be in a place, of the improvement you get to your well-being and your sense of self is really important. But I think we just need to get more people into the environment. 1 in 5 kids in the UK has never been to the ocean, and you know, speaking to these kids, these other pool sea savers, their main message was, we need to get more kids experiencing this ocean, because if we can, then they're going to fall in love with it too, and they are going to be ocean advocates who can help us with this message and help us protect it and spend more time there and benefit themselves. So we've set up a charity recently called Seaful, with the very, very kind help of Felix and of Ocean Ambassadors. And that charity's purpose is to help get more people out into nature, into blue spaces, getting them experiencing it, learning about it, connecting with it, and having that real feeling of immersion in those experiences, and empowering people to be advocates and to be stewards of the environment as a result. So as Felix said earlier, there is just no substitute for actually getting people out into these places, experiencing them for themselves.
Yeah, totally agree. So that's called
Seaful,
Seaful.
S-E-A-F-U-L. And I will say as well, just on that note, equally, you know, it's all well and good me taking a load of kids from inner city Birmingham to the coast in Devon, but also we need to empower people to find places on their doorstep that they can love. And you'll know that from Ealing Wildlife Group. You're in central London, and yet you have this amazing resource, you know, these amazing green spaces that people can enjoy. And I think helping people find places locally that they can enjoy on a regular basis is really important. We have these little patches of nature throughout the entire country. We just need to help connect people to them.
Absolutely. I think we could talk for hours and hours, but it might be time to turn over to our audience questions. I'm conscious of time. We said the event was until 8:15. Anyone who does need to head off, absolutely fine to drop out. But I think myself, Felix, Cal and Heidi, probably okay sticking around to about 5:30 if there are that many questions or people want to discuss things. So Heidi, over to you.
Yeah, and we've had quite a few questions come in, which is lovely. Thank you very much for all your engagement. I'm going to try and group them together so we try and answer as many as possible. And I think I'm just going to start out. Rory's just mentioned in the chat box there that it's really about getting our heads around stepping back and not micromanaging, which I think is a really nice way of kind of putting a kind of our influence on nature together. But a question from Rob. The rewilding movement at the moment still seems to feel very much like someone's vision of how the landscape should look. And it's changed so many times throughout the years. Is there a general consensus as to what rewild we should be going back to? And Fiona's also said, how do you determine when rewilding is an appropriate management option and when perhaps it's no longer suitable? So question around when do we step in and who decides what that rewild looks like?
Yeah, I can cover that one. I think you guys hop in if you want, but I think unfortunately we live in such a changed landscape. I think I might have mentioned, or maybe not, shifting baseline syndrome. When we looked at the NEP image of before and after, and we saw that green and pleasant land, it's very romantic to think, oh, that's wilderness. Or look at the Scottish, you know, background that Cal showed there, and you see quite denuded hillsides with not very much tree cover, which would have been the landscape before, when there was lots of deer around, but there was also lots of predators of deer. So unfortunately in this country, with such a kind of a damaged and altered landscape, there are elements of romantic large-scale rewilding where you literally step off and do nothing that are just not practical, and some management needs to happen. So for example, in Scotland, you know, people want to go back to kind of wooded valleys and kind of trees and better vegetation on, or more diverse vegetation on the hillsides than just heather moorland or, you know, kind of quite sparse grassland. Unfortunately, we are in a position where, you know, there's an overpopulation of deer in Scotland. We don't have lynx, wolves, bears and things that we used to have. There is an element of, you know, being responsible and taking all stakeholders like the general public and the farming community into any decisions to rewild. And I think unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your views, you know, reintroducing wolves and bears back into Scotland might be a step too far for the rewilding movement. So I think, yeah, unfortunately, the realities are we can't just kind of leave it to nature entirely. There are some elements of management that have to happen. If you're rewilding a small or a large farm, for example, you know, you're going to probably have a fence around that, and you're going to probably have to take out some of the herbivores, you know, if you go down the route of reintroducing herbivores. So there's an element of management, but it's different to traditional conservation, which has really serious objectives and aims and is constantly managing something for an end goal that's completely defined. Rewilding kind of gives back a bit of control to nature and says, let's see what happens, and let's not be too concerned about that end game, you know, that Felix mentioned. Would you have anything to add on that, Felix or Cal?
Can I just add a bit about the ocean? The ocean.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit different with ocean management. So when we look at the reduction in biodiversity in the ocean, a lot of that is overfishing or its destruction of the seabed. And so sort of building on what Sean was saying there, with rewilding the ocean, we need to have fisheries management, and we need to have marine spatial planning. But one of the most instantaneous things that we can do is to reduce destructive fishing practices in vulnerable areas. So at the moment there's a campaign called the Our Seas campaign, which is in Scotland. It's basically looking at bringing in a limit to bottom trawling and dredging, which are the most destructive fishing practices around the whole coast of Scotland, and particularly in vulnerable areas. And you can check it out, it's at ourseas.scot, and there's an amazing film there. But with the ocean, it's very much a case of this biodiversity is threatened because of our exploitation of fish stocks and our damaging practice to the seabed. And with that, we just need to stop them as a first step. You know, we're not looking at introducing new species in the UK anyway. You know, there are coral restoration projects in more tropical climates, but certainly in the UK, we just need to give the ocean a chance to recover. And if you do that, it is incredible how quickly it can do that and how resilient it is. We just need to stop our destructive practices. And I think, again, with that, like, that comes down to our understanding of why we should be doing that, like why the ocean is important to every single man, woman and child on this planet, not just to those who directly make a living from it. So yeah, a little bit different for the ocean.
Could I come in here?
Yeah, go for it, Felix.
I'd just like to add to Cal's point that as a lawyer, I'd like to mention the potential law of ecocide. You've heard of genocide. Well, ecocide is the bespoilation of the earth, and that can be made into the oceans. And in my opinion, bottom dredging the whole of the ocean bed is ecocide. And what I'm getting at is that we're going to use this ecocide law was nearly passed by the United Nations 30 years ago, but it could be an international law that has an application towards poaching in Africa, towards the bottom dredging, all sorts of things that actually is a crime, not just a contract. It's an actual crime. And if this is brought in, you ought to watch it, because it's coming, and it's coming, creeping in quicker, more, well, it was slow, but it's picking up pace, I should say. Ecocide, think about it.
Great, thanks, Felix.
Great. So I think you've answered in areas lots of other different questions, but we're going to plow on anyway and try and get to the root of some of these questions. So Eleanor mentions that she works at the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, and she said, is rewilding just as effective on a smaller scale, or is it best to have large-scale rewilding areas such as NEP, but connected with wildlife corridors? And again, Ian has said there are concerns about rewilding land because of the loss of agricultural land. And how do those two kind of fit together?
Yeah, good questions. I would say that rewilding, in whatever your definition of it is, if you're allowing nature to recover, if you are a landowner of any particular size, allowing a little bit more space for nature is good enough for me. And, you know, it's not about, you know, we hear about this with climate change, you know, it's not about everyone being absolutely perfect and doing everything right. It's about everyone trying to do one thing or two things well. And that way we will see incremental benefits. So, you know, NEP as a kind of model example of rewilding often gets criticized. Well, you know, if I had a 3,500 acre estate, wouldn't that be great? Of course, I could do wonderful things with it, and it would be the flagship rewilding farmland, but that's very expensive. And another critique of rewilding is that it's a hobby, a new fashionable hobby for the elite and for people with a lot of land. But I think whatever amount of land you have and whatever you do with it, you can always apply rewilding principles to that. So as simple as, you know, I was talking earlier and I was saying, step off the lawnmower. We have this obsession with manicured lawns, you know, stop mowing your lawn, stop using petrol to keep the grass on your lawn short. Get a little lazier, get a little messier in your garden, allow some wildflowers to grow in your lawn that will provide pollen for bees and things like that. And just, you can do very tiny little things, and everyone doing tiny little things will grow that connected habitat and will start to, you know, sink carbon into the soil, and every little helps basically. So I think I think the snobbery around scale is can be quite harmful. And I think actually, what harm if people are saying, I'm rewilding my lawn, I'm rewilding my back garden. We don't have to be purists about the term, but I think the principle is good. And I think that one of the reasons it's gaining so much attention and traction is it does capture people's hearts and it captures people's imagination. And it's a very good way to get people to reconnect with nature and why it's important to us. Great. Felix, you probably have some thoughts on that, do you? Or
I'd just like to add that I've got an idea for you, Sean, that some farms could have a kite mark of excellence, which is they have a certain amount of land, which is what you call rewilding, and on every farm.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We've talked before, myself and Felix have talked before about, you know, how do farmers make it work? Like, farmers have to make a living, they have to make revenue and profit. How do you make rewilding work? And there certainly could be, you know, marketing benefits for your products on farm if you say that you're rewilding a certain percentage of it, or you're applying rewilding principles. But an assurance scheme, you know, would be one way maybe of kind of incentivizing. I think we're seeing really positive signs that a lot of landowners and farmers are kind of looking at it as an option, definitely.
That segues really nicely into the next set of questions. Ian asks, what's the government involvement in this? Do they sponsor projects such as this? And do we have land at the moment that can be rewild? And Emma mentions that her father was an organic farmer and had fields that spent a lot of time set aside. And she asks, was this part of a rewilding agenda, or was it just crop production management? But she thinks it was quite government led. So where are we now with government intervention?
Yeah, we're in a bit of a grey area at the moment because of Brexit. So one of the things pre-Brexit was that we had the Common Agricultural Policy, which awarded farmers for kind of food production and the volume of food produced, and there were certain aspects of that that were, say, harmful to biodiversity, because it did encourage farmers to push right up to the field margins and take out hedgerows and try and get more land into production. The new system that the UK government is talking about is trialling what they're calling ELMS, or the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will be very similar, hopefully, to some of the European stewardship schemes. So alongside the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, there was also opt-in stewardship schemes where farmers could be in a high, medium or lower tier and do certain things to encourage nature and biodiversity alongside food production. So those were government incentives for farmers to almost rewild, but actually they were quite targeted, and they were quite along the lines of more traditional conservation, like you had to sow this much crop cover for wild bird seed, or you had to you know, create a certain number or area of ponds or wetlands on your farm. The ELM scheme is under trial at the moment, and it's not quite clear where it's going to go in the next couple of years, or what the finished product will look like. But the rewilding lobby, Rewilding Britain, and some organizations like that are really trying to see that natural capital or nature recovery gains from rewilding should be included in as one of the stewardship options in the ELM scheme, but time will tell. So we're in a bit of a no man's land at the moment to see what the final product will be on that.
Thank you. And just on that, another question from Fionn to Cal. Green recovery is massive on the UK agenda. This in part has resulted in a surge of investment and eagerness to establish large areas of marine renewable energy as quickly as possible. So of course this will impact our marine environments, although moving away from fossil fuels is a necessity. So Cal, it's a bit open-ended, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really difficult actually, because there's so much focus, like I was saying before, on decarbonising and having these net zero goals that the government has created. And I think what we really need to do is have some more joined up thinking. Like it's no good damming a river to create hydroelectric energy, which is, you know, being called green energy, when you're completely destroying an ecosystem, and where we know that that ecosystem intact can sequester more carbon than a small scale dam could produce. You know, you're looking at offshore wind farms and the damage that they cause to the seabed. It's on a very, very individual basis. But I think rather than looking at this, you know, we've got all this, all the XR stuff, all this kind of chat about climate change, this huge narrative about climate change at the minute, and it's so important, and it's so important that we reach those net zero goals, but not at the expense of losing biodiversity, and not at the expense of changing land use and destroying nature, which is, as we've seen with this IPBES report, is the most pressing matter on the agenda at the moment. And so I think at the moment, you know, climate change is very kind of, it is a very important and a very popular conversation, but we just need to be looking at it cleverly and more thoughtfully. There's, you know, it's a hugely difficult thing to kind of put a formula to. You can't say, you know, that hydro scheme or that offshore wind farm is going to be better for the planet overall without doing the calculations, looking at the impact of it, looking at the impact of the biodiversity loss that you're going to create. Does that make sense? It's got to, everything's got to be considered, and I think looking at each of these crises in isolation is so dangerous, because there's so much more going on than just carbon emissions.
Yeah, I was going to say it'd be interesting to see what happens with COP26, the UN climate change conference happening in Glasgow at the start of November, if we're all out of lockdown by then, hopefully. But yeah.
I think the rewilding conversation, the fact that it is becoming more popular, as you were saying before, Sean, is a really good thing, because it's bringing these terms like biodiversity and nature recovery into people's consciousness. And we've heard a lot over the last few years about you know, the terms climate change is now in everybody's consciousness, and maybe we just need to kind of not, you know, bring all the negativity and doom and gloom and say, hang on, we've got another crisis on our hands, but kind of, you know, talk about the potential for recovery for the other parts of the planet, and also how that impacts climate change. So I mean, you look at the seabed and the amount of carbon that sequesters. Kelp forests take in more carbon than 20 times more carbon than terrestrial forests. Seagrass is a massively important ecosystem for sequestering carbon. So you know, you really got to look at it as one kind of holistic ecosystem based approach, I think, rather than individual crises.
Thanks, Cal. I'm just eager to get on to the next few questions, just so we get as many in as possible. And actually, this is kind of leads on from where you've just finished off. Jeff in the Netherlands says, which type of ecosystem needs to be rewilded most urgently? No arguing, please.
Oceans.
They're all connected. I think anything anyone can do is good. I think Cal is absolutely right. I mean, that statistic that 50% of the oxygen on our planet is produced in the ocean. Yeah, we're all told it's like woods, rainforests, plant trees. You know, it's quite a staggering statistic. I think on the terrestrial side, something that gets forgotten, I suppose, and I think planting trees is seen as a solution, but actually our peat bogs and peat moorlands, upland peat habitats, are a massive carbon sink as well, and we've destroyed those with kind of our land use, whether it's extraction of peat for fuel, or whether it's kind of burning of kind of heather moorland and peat moorland for grouse shooting or recreation and things like that. But upland peat bogs and things are actually probably one of the most important terrestrial habitats to rewild if we're just talking about carbon sequestration. And then wetlands in general. I mean, the agricultural revolution has you know, obliterated lots of our wetlands, and we've polluted a lot of our wetlands as well. If we allow wetlands to restore and to rewild, we'll be in a much, much better position from climate change and biodiversity as well. And things like flood resilience and stuff like that, you know, that come into it with climate change and consequences as well. So wetlands and peatlands for me, oceans for Cal. all of it.
I mean, all of it. But I would say as well, you know, stopping changing land use from natural habitats to anything that's kind of destructive is the first step, isn't it? You know, actually not destroying any more natural habitats is the first step.
Great. I think this is a really interesting question from James. How is it possible to reconcile the use of large herbivores for conservation grazing, as seen at NEP, with the need to reduce carbon emissions, a major cause of which is methane produced by the meat and dairy industry? I know, Sean, you have an excellent answer for this question.
Pressure. This is something that I think is quite a misconception, and it's used as a kind of a soundbite a lot, that animal agriculture is bad. And, you know, vegan diets, for example, on the flip side of this argument sometimes is good. Those two things represent a massive range. And some of the studies on greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture really are heavily taken from industrialized animal agriculture in South America and the United States. A lot of those studies have come out on grass-based, even intensive UK grass-based systems for beef production, for example, have far less greenhouse gas emission than that kind of agenda or that kind of messaging would have you believe. And actually animal agriculture, when we compare it to, for example, international travel, airplane travel, is fairly minuscule. But when you start using herbivores on kind of natural systems on a lower density, you know, there's not many animals out on the likes of NEP when you compare it to a more intensive beef production unit on Italian ryegrass monoculture, for example. The use of herbivores in rewilding on a cost-benefit analysis, the risk or the addition of methane or greenhouse gases from those herbivores is absolutely minuscule and is totally cancelled out by the benefits you're getting from that rewilding system that incorporates herbivores into it. I hope that's okay.
It's a really controversial.
I'm quite passionate about that subject, and it's
very controversial.
Maybe we'll do another webinar about that specific topic, actually.
Absolutely. I'm very aware that we only have 2 minutes left, and every question we have left are really big, wide-ranging. But I think one from Simon would really nicely just kind of finish it off. Could Sean please explain some of the detail in what has happened to the land in the before and after photographs shown from NEP? So what's happened from that agricultural picture to what NEP looks like now?
Okay, so I'm going to, in a very short answer would be, buy the book Wilding by Isabella Tree, who is one of the owners of NEP, and read it, because she describes in detail what's happened over the last 20 years to the land there. And it's incredibly fascinating. They were nearly, you know, chased out of the local village by neighboring farmers because all of these agricultural weeds started to self-seed into the fields that were normally sprayed or taken off through harvest. And there was creeping thistle and ragwort and all sorts of weeds, which are just plants in the wrong place. It's a man-made construct. They're actually wildflowers that are very important for biodiversity. But the land basically wants to recover and regenerate itself, and it's a constant dynamic process between plants seeding and growing into different layers of grassland and shrubland and scrub, and then small trees, and then larger trees and growing into woodland. And then the other dynamic process is naturally herbivores fighting back some of that vegetation. So you're constantly getting this changing landscape of plant succession and herbivore pushback, and other processes in the landscape as well changing. So basically what they saw at NEP when they stopped doing anything is the early regeneration of woodland through kind of trees and plants self-seeding into the previously cultivated areas. But read Wilding by Isabella Tree. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and just really, really hopeful of what can be achieved with rewilding.
Great. I think we're going to have to leave the questions there.
We'll make a note of them, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a note of the ones we have remaining. So
Great. Well, look, guys, thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you have enjoyed it. It's hopefully the first of a series, and we'd love to see you back. If you have any topic suggestions or things you'd like us to cover in future webinars, then please just do leave a comment. Get in touch with us if you want to kind of get involved or follow our journey. If you go to agrewilding.co.uk, you can sign up to our newsletter. And I'd encourage you to check out Ocean Ambassadors and Cal's new project, Seafull, as well. And Cal's website, calmajor.com, I think, Cal, is that right? Yeah, great. Okay, so with that, I'll say goodbye, and I want to thank Felix and Cal for their time. It's been an absolute pleasure putting this together, and thank Heidi as well for her hard work behind the scenes, getting it together and asking everyone's questions.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.